Sahana Vavatu, Sahano Bhunaktu, Sahaviryan Karavavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Om. Good. Welcome to our weekly Bhagavad Gita class. We'll continue today in Chapter 2. We'll begin, as always, with some recitation. As I'm reciting, please glance at the meaning, so the meaning is in your mind when you repeat after me. Verse 26. Ata chainam nitya jatam, ata chainam nitya jatam, nityam va manyase mritam, nityam va manyase mritam, tathapi tvam mahabaho, tathapi tvam mahabaho, nainam shochitam arhasi, nainam shochitam arhasi, jatasya hi dhruvo mrityur, jatasya hi dhruvor mrityur, dhruvam janma mritasya cha, dhruvam janma mritasya cha, tasmara pariharyerte, tasmara pariharyerte, natvam shochitam arhasi, natvam shochitam arhasi, avyaktadini bhutani, avyaktadini bhutani, vyaktamadhyani bharata, vyaktamadhyani bharata, avyaktanidhananyeva, avyaktanidhananyeva, tatra ka paridevana, tatra ka paridevana, ascharyavat pashyati kaschrenam, ascharyavat pashyati kaschrenam, ascharyavat vadati tathaiva chanyaha, ascharyavat vadati tathaiva chanyaha, ascharyavat chainamanyah shrinoti, ascharyavat chainamanyah shrinoti, shrutvapyenam vedana chaina kaschata, shrutvapyenam vedana chaiva kaschata, dehi nityam avadhyoyam, dehi nityam avadhyoyam, dehe sarvasya bharata, dehe sarvasya bharata, tasmat sarvani bhutani, tasmat sarvani bhutani, natvam shochitam arhasi, natvam shochitam arhasi, swadharmam api chavekshya, swadharmam api chavekshya, navikampitam arhasi, navikampitam arhasi, dharmyadhi yuddhat shreyonyata, dharmadhi yuddhat shreyonyata, kshatriyasya na vidyate, kshatriyasya na vidyate, yadrichaya chopapannam, yadrichaya chopapannam, svargadvaram apavritam, svargadvaram apavritam, sukhinah kshatriyah partha, sukhinah kshatriyah partha, labhante yuddham idrisham, labhante yuddham idrisham, ata chettvamimam dharmyam, ata chettvamimam dharmyam, sangramam nakarishyasi, sangramam nakarishyasi, tatha swadharmam kirtancha, tatha swadharmam kirtancha, hitva papam avapsyasi, Tva papam avapsyasi. We'll stop there. Nice to get these verses in our ear a little bit. And let's return to where we left off. We've concluded our prior verse with our prior class with verse 28. And just to set the context from verse 11 onwards in chapter 2, Sri Krishna begins his Upadesha, his spiritual teaching to Arjuna. And he begins by saying, Arjuna, there is no reason for you to grieve. And then he goes on to give a number of reasons for that Arjuna has no need to grieve. The first reason, of course, is that while many bodies will fall dead on the battlefield, nothing will happen to Atma. The true self of each person will be utterly unaffected by the bloodshed on the battlefield. Then we saw in the last class, Sri Krishna shifted to a second reason for Arjuna not to grieve. And that first reason was with regard to Atma, Satchidananda, your true self. Second reason was from the standpoint of the Sukshma Sharira, the subtle body, that which enlivens the physical body. And as we discussed in some detail, should not be confused in any way at all with Atma. Atma and Sukshma Sharira are two entirely different realities. So that Sukshma Sharira, at the time of death, detaches itself from the physical body, travels on, driven by the forces of karma, and takes a new body. That's what this last verse said, verse 28. Avyaktadini bhutani. All those Sukshma Shariras are at first unmanifest, vyaktamadhyani, and then they acquire physical bodies and become vyakta, manifest, and avyakta nidhanani eva. Nidhanani. Finally, in the end, all of those Sukshma Shariras again become avyakta, unmanifest, when the bodies die and the Sukshma Shariras travel on. So this is the second of actually three reasons Sri Krishna gives Arjuna that he shouldn't grieve. We have a little bit more on the Sukshma Sharira, and then we'll see the third reason in just a couple more verses. Okay, with that introduction, we'll pick up the thread with this verse with the longer meter. Ascharyavat pashyati kaschyadenam, ascharyavat pashyati kaschyadenam, ascharyavat vadati tataiva chanyaha, ascharyavat vadati tataiva chanyaha, ascharyavat chainamanya shrinoti, ascharyavat chainamanya shrinoti, Shrutwapyenam vedana chaiva kaschata, Shrutwapyenam vedana chaiva kaschata. Ascharyavat is something really amazing, amazing because of its rarity. And that's the context here. The rarity of this wisdom being imparted by Sri Krishna to Arjuna. Arjuna didn't understand properly that nothing would happen to Atma when the bodies fall on the battlefield. Arjuna did not understand that the Sukshma Sharira of each person would travel on at the time of death. This is not always well understood. You may understand very well, but the majority of people have not had the opportunity that you and I have had to explore these teachings very thoroughly. So for that reason, these teachings and this wisdom is considered rare. Here the word ascharyavat, which means, better translation is amazing, but amazing in the context of it being exceedingly rare. And that's what Sri Krishna comments on. He says, Ascharyavat, it is amazing. It is exceedingly rare. What is it? What is exceedingly rare? That kaschat, that someone, pashyati, should see enam, this one. This one could enam, this one could refer to atma, could also refer to sukshma sharira. And here there's no reason, no need to differentiate. The enam, this atma or this sukshma sharira, recognizing which there's no reason to grieve at the time of death. And pashyati, kaschat pashyati, someone sees, but sees not in a physical sense, but in a more metaphorical sense. See in the sense of to know, like when we say in English, do you see what I mean? You can't see a meaning. It's a very common metaphorical usage, I think, in all languages, including Sanskrit here. So, kaschit pashyati, it's amazing that someone should see this truth, that someone should recognize this fact. And who were those that discovered this truth in the first place? The ancient rishis. In fact, very appropriately, those ancient rishis are called mantra drashtaraha, literally the seers of the mantras. You've probably read someplace, the ancient seers. Seers in the sense that they could see what others could not see, they could discover what others could not discover. So this first line refers to the ancient rishis, how amazing it is and how rare it is that those rishis that made this discovery, those rishis themselves were exceedingly rare. Not only were the rishis rare, but in the second line, ascharyavat, it is amazing, it is exceedingly rare. What is exceedingly rare? At the end of the second line, cha and anyaha. It's exceedingly rare that others, tata eva, in the same manner, vadati, should speak. First line, pashyati, should see, should discover. Second line, vadati, speak. So it's exceedingly rare that others should speak in a sense of should teach what the ancient rishis discovered. First line refers to the ancient rishis. Second line refers to all of our gurus, all of our teachers, the lineage of teachers. So first line, how amazing it is that these ancient rishis discovered this truth. Second line, how amazing it is that generation after generation of gurus, teachers, continue to vadati, continue to teach the same wisdom. Third line, ascharyavat, third time, amazing it is, how rare it is that in the middle of the line, anyaha, others, shrinoti, should hear, backing up, enam. You see, breaking up the words, ascharyavat, cha, enam. Enam, like in the first line, this one, this atma, or this sukshma sharira, this truth. So the third line says, how amazing it is, how rare it is that others, anyaha shrinoti, should hear this teaching and should understand this teaching. The third line, of course, is referring to students. First line, rishis. Second line, gurus. Third line, students. Who? Shrinoti, who hear. Then the fourth line is they call it the kicker. What is the kicker? The kicker means something surprising. Fourth line, shrutva, breaking the words apart. Shrutva api enam. And shrutva, we have to get the last line. Shrutva api enam. And having api, even, shrutva, having heard enam, having heard this. So there are others who, last word kaschit, and there is still someone, some others, some students will say, kaschit, some student, Shrutva api enam, having heard this teaching taught by a guru, na veda, but doesn't understand. Look, very nice, the succession. Amazing that the rishis discovered it. Second line, amazing, rare it is that the gurus teach this. Third line, rare it is that a student has an opportunity to hear it. Fourth line, which is the little joke, it's not amazing. It's not amazing. Notice the word Ashcharyavad is not present in the fourth line because it's not amazing at all that some students hear this teaching and naveda. They don't understand. They don't get it. And so it's not really a joke, but it's amazing that the rishis taught it, that the rishis discovered it, amazing that the gurus teach it, amazing that we can learn these teachings. But it's not amazing. It's not surprising at all that so many people hear this teaching and they don't get it. Why is it not amazing? This is a big and important topic we'll just touch upon very briefly here. These teachings are able to impart knowledge to you only if you are ready to receive this knowledge, only if you are a prepared student. This prepared student is an important term. The Sanskrit term, you should know, is adhikari. Adhikari, in this context, means a prepared student. We're not speaking Hindi now, so we're not talking about somebody who's in charge, as it would mean in Hindi. In this context, as a Sanskrit word here, adhikari means qualified student or prepared student. And if you are not an adhikari, if you're not a prepared student, excuse me, you could hear this taught by the best teacher available. You won't get it if you are not adequately prepared. An example I've given in many classes, I'll give it one more time. When I was in college, I had to study calculus. In fact, a lot of, I think 4 semesters of calculus. And so based on that, I made up a story about a student in the calculus class, first year calculus class. And the student attends every class, takes copious notes, does all of this, comes to the end of the semester, the student writes the exam and gets 0 points on the exam. How is that possible? Well, it's certainly possible because this student never studied algebra, which is a prerequisite, never studied geometry and trigonometry, which are prerequisites. This student was still struggling with long division. Not a prepared student. Therefore, even though he attended the classes, nothing went in. So for that reason, the last line refers to the one who lacks the state of being an adhikari, a qualified student. And it's not surprising at all. There are so many, and they don't get it. Okay, continuing. Dehi nityam avadhyoyam, Dehi nityam avadhyoyam, Dehe sarvasya bharata, Dehe sarvasya bharata, Tasmat sarvani bhutani, Tasmat sarvani bhutani, Natvam shochitam arhasi, Natvam shochitam arhasi. Good. This verse really concludes a discussion that began with verse 11. Beginning with verse 11, Sri Krishna began teaching Arjuna that he didn't need to grieve because nothing happens to Atma at the time of death, and a Sukshma Sharira travels on at the time of death. Therefore, with regard to the Dehi, remember I gave that expression? Deha is body. Dehi is one who possesses a body or one who is dwelling within the body. As the indweller of the body. Dehi can refer to Atma. Dehi can also refer to Sukshma Sharira. In this context, it doesn't make any difference, because from both standpoints, Arjuna is told there's no reason to grieve. So actually the better interpretation here is Dehi referring to Atma. Perhaps it could mean either Atma or Sukshma Sharira, but I think Atma is the better meaning here because of the adjectives that follow. So that Dehi, that indwelling true self, Satchidananda Atma, that indwelling self is Nityam, eternal, unborn, uncreated, and unchanging. Sukshma Sharira changes. The Dehi, the Nityam, eternal in the sense of unchanging, definitely refers to Atma, not Sukshma Sharira. So that indwelling self is Nityam, eternal, Avadhyaha, indestructible, can't be killed. Ayam, this one that Dehe, in the body, Sarvasya, of all people, of all beings, the one, Ayam Dehi, this indwelling self who dwells Dehi, in the bodies, Sarvasya, of all people, is Nityam, eternal, and Avadhyaha, indestructible. Bharata, O Arjuna, O descendant of King Bharat, Tasmat, therefore. And here's the conclusion. Winding things up, that the discussion that began with verse 11, Tasmat, therefore, Arjuna, in the final line, Tvam, you, na arhasi, you have no reason, shochitum, to grieve. There is no reason for you to grieve. You should not grieve. Sarvani bhutani, in the third line, for all beings, for all these warriors who are about to fall on the battlefield. Remember the context. This is the morning of the first of the 18 days of battle. No one has died yet, but shortly after this dialogue is over, thousands and tens of thousands or more will die in that battlefield. So Sri Krishna concludes this subject matter. Therefore, Arjuna, there is no reason for you to mourn. Now, we're going to see another shift of context. We said that Sri Krishna said back in verse 11, there's no reason for you to mourn. Then he gave the first reason, because Atma, nothing happens to Atma at the time of death. And with second reason, for the Sukshma Sharira, Sukshma Sharira travels at the time of death. So for those two reasons, there's no reason to mourn. And now comes a third reason. And last of the reasons given in this second chapter. Swadharmamapi chaveksha, swadharmamapi chaveksha, navikampitum arhasi, navikampitum arhasi, dharmyadhi yuddhat shreyonyata, dharmyadhi yuddhat shreyonyata, kshatriyasya na vidyate, kshatriyasya na vidyate. Swadharmam api cha, and also avekshya, having in view, aviksha, keeping in view, with respect to swadharmam, your swadharma, your duties, your own duties. Aveksha, with regard to your own duties. Apicha, also with regard to your own duties, Arjuna. Na vikampitum arhasi. Na arhasi, you should not vikampitum. You shouldn't waver. You shouldn't vacillate. You shouldn't be indecisive about fighting this war. And the fact is, Arjuna has to fight this war. So First reason that Arjuna shouldn't grieve was with regard to Atma. Second reason was with regard to Sukshma Sharira. Third reason now is with regard to Swadharma, Arjuna's duties. Why? Dharmat hi. You have to break the words apart. Oh, what a mess. Dharmat hi yudhat shreyas anyata. Breaking the words apart. Dharmat hi yudhat shreyas anyata. So the he means because. So first half, Sri Krishna says you shouldn't have any doubts with regard to your swadharma. He, in the third line, because anyat shreyas, anything better, yudhat, than a war, but not any war. Dharmat, dharmyat, yudhat. Dharmya means a dharmic war. Dharmyat, yudhat. Anything better than a righteous war. Remember, we, at the very beginning of our study, we were careful to define a righteous war, a dharma yuddha. And we gave a very specific reason, a very specific definition. Definition was a dharma yuddha is a war in which not fighting the war has worse consequences than fighting the war. This Mahabharata war was a dharma yuddha. For Arjuna not to fight the war, which would have led to the loss of the Pandavas, would definitely have lost that war if Arjuna did not fight. So if Arjuna failed to fight, the consequences would have been worse. So, but Sri Krishna now says that with regard to your own duties, you should also fight the war. That's a third reason for not vacillating about fighting the war. Why? Because anya shreyaha, anything better than dharmyat yudhat, anything better than a righteous war, na vidyate, doesn't exist. There is nothing better than a righteous war, kshatriyasya. This is the important word. For a kshatriya. Please don't leave that word out, because if you do, then you say there's nothing better than a righteous war. War is still war, righteous or unrighteous. War is horrible. So here, the key word is kshatriyasya, for a kshatriya, from Arjuna's personal standpoint, as a kshatriya, as a member of the warrior caste, from that very specific perspective, Sri Krishna says there's nothing better than a righteous war. Why? And he's going to explain why in the coming verses. In the next verse. Yeah, next verse right away we'll give. So why is it that Sri Krishna can say to Arjuna, there's nothing better for you as a kshatriya, there's nothing better than a righteous war? Why? Yadrichaya chopapannam, yadrichaya chopapannam, swargadwaram apavritam, swargadwaram apavritam, sukhina kshatriya partha, sukhina kshatriya partha, labhante yuddhamidrisham, labhante yuddhamidrisham. Yadrachaya cha upapannam. Separate those words. Cha, and. Upapannam. This is referring to the war, the battle. This war, which is upapannam, which is gained, which is that which you possess, is upapannam. And Arjuna possesses this war yadrichaya, by chance. That which is upapannam, acquired, Yadrichaya, due to good fortune, would be a good translation here. Yeah, a battle gained by good fortune. That's a nice translation. This battle, which is gained by your good fortune, is Swarga Dwaram Apavritam. It is a dwaram, a doorway to Swarga, to heaven, which is Apavritam, which is wide open. It is a wide open gate or doorway to heaven. Now, how can a battle, a war, be a gateway to heaven? Well, first of all, it's not a gateway to heaven for everyone, but it is for a kshatriya who is fulfilling his dharma. And here's, actually the commentator makes a very interesting observation here. He says, if you do a lot of rituals in your lifetime, you will accumulate a huge amount of punya, good karmas, which will determine that you will definitely go to heaven. If you do so many rituals, you can accumulate enough good karma that is virtually guaranteed that you'll go to heaven. But you have to wait until you die to go to heaven. This is a commentator's observation. And he says, for a kshatriya, dying in a battle is better than doing all these rituals. Why? By fighting the war, you're accumulating good karma. Just like by doing the rituals, this other fellow was accumulating good karmas. For the kshatriya, by fighting the war, by doing swadharma, by fulfilling your duties, you are accumulating good karmas, and then you don't have to wait because you're probably going to die right there and then on the battlefield. This is a commentator's perspective. So in that sense, this battle gained by your good fortune is an open gate to heaven. It's better than a lifetime of rituals. And he continues, Sri Krishna continues, Partha, O son of Kunti, Pritha is one of the names for Kunti, son of Kunti, Arjuna. O Arjuna, Kshatriyaha, warriors, members of the Kshatriya caste, are Sukhinaha, are happy. They are happy, why? Labhante, because having gained, those Kshatriyas are happy because Labhante, they gain Yudham, a battle, Idrisham, of this kind means a dharma, a dharma yuddha, a righteous war, a war in which by fighting, those kshatriyas can fulfill their duties, and by fulfilling their duties, they accumulate good karma, and if they should happen to die on the battlefield, their good karmas will take them to heaven. Now, we have some interesting verses. Ata che tvamimam dharmyam, ata che tvamimam dharmyam, sangramam na karishyasi, sangramam na karishyasi, tata swadharmam kirtancha, tata swadharmam kirtancha, hitva papam avapsyasi, hitva papam avapsyasi. The next several verses, Sri Krishna uses an interesting tactic to convince Arjuna to fight. The tactic is to consider the consequences if he doesn't fight, the consequences of failing to fulfill his swadharma, his duties as a warrior. And that's what he says. Ata chet, if, ata, now. So this now is setting up this, in the, I think, 3-4 verses about if you don't fight. Chet, if, tvam, you in the middle of the first line, you Arjuna, second line, na karishyasi, if you do not do, if you do not engage yourself in what? Imam, this, dharmyam, righteous sangramam, battle. In this righteous battle, na karishyasi, if you do not engage yourself in this battle, Arjuna, tataha, in the third line, then what will be the consequences? Swadharmam kirtancha hitva. Hitva, giving up, forfeiting. Forfeiting what? Swadharmam, the fulfillment of your own duties. Kirtancha, and fame, the fame of being a glorious warrior on the battlefield. Both of these, hitva, abandoning them both, papam, sin, avapsyasi, you will gain. Papam avapsyasi, Arjuna, you will gain sin, hitva, having abandoned swadharmam, your own duties. And kirtam cha hitva is making a reference to the fact that if Arjuna fails to fight, the consequences are twofold. There's an immediate consequence and a later consequence. The immediate consequence is the word kirtam hitva, abandoning fame, giving up fame, which means if Arjuna fails to fight, he'll become, the opposite of fame is infamous. And Sri Krishna is going to talk about that in the next verse. So Arjuna is going to be despised by all these mighty warriors if he abandons the battlefield. And that is the first of two consequences, a consequence that happens immediately, right there and then on the battlefield. Then there's a second consequence, a delayed consequence, and that is hitva swadharmam, having given up his own dharma, having failed to carry out his own duties, papam avapsyasi, Arjuna, you will incur sin, and having incurred that sin, you will suffer consequences later, karmic consequences later, either later in this life or in the next life. So here Sri Krishna is pointing out two consequences, an immediate consequence of losing fame, glory, and a later consequence of acquiring sin, which will, according to the laws of karma, cause Arjuna to suffer later in this life or in the next. Now Sri Krishna is going to elaborate on his loss of fame, the immediate consequence. Akirtam chapi bhutani, akirtam chapi bhutani, katayashyanti te vyayam, katayashyanti te vyayam, sambhavitasya cha kirtir, sambhavitasya cha kirtir, maranadati rachyate, maranadati rachyate. Bhutani, end of the first line, end. Cha api, and also. Bhutani, literally creatures, but in this context, people. Bhutani, people. Second line, katayashyanti. Good for our Sanskrit students. Future tense, will say. Bhutani, people. Katayashyanti, will say, will talk about te, your, go back to the top, akirtim. Kirti is fame. Akirti, infamy. When a great warrior walks away from the battlefield. Remember, Arjuna's, back in chapter 1, Arjuna was ready to walk away from the battlefield and go live in a cave up in the Himalayas. So Arjuna is considering abandoning the battlefield. So therefore, and if he leaves the battlefield with all the warriors watching him, what will they think? What will they say? So Bhutani, all people, Katayashyanti, will talk about Te akirtam, they'll talk about your infamy. Te avyayam akirtam, your unceasing infamy, your terrible infamy. Or they'll talk avyayam, and you can't really take it as a participle. My translation here is forever. Forever is is an adverb. Technically, that can't be an adverb, so the translation here is not correct. Unceasing infamy would be a better translation here. And Sri Krishna continues, Sambhavitasya cha akirtam, cha and sambhavitasya, for someone who is famous, like you, Arjuna. And Arjuna is famous. Amongst all the warriors on the battlefield, there are, maybe several dozen who are really, really famous, well known, and Arjuna is certainly one of the most well known amongst all the warriors. So sambhavitasya, for someone who is famous, for someone who is highly regarded, honorable, that's a good translation. For someone who's highly regarded, akirtir, the opposite of fame is infamy, or here disgrace is a nice translation. Disgrace, maranat atirichyate. Disgrace is atirichyate, is worse than maranat, than death. For someone who is highly regarded, infamy is worse than death. Now, we have to understand the context. Arjuna is not an ordinary person like you and me. Arjuna is this famous warrior, and famous people are held to a different standard. If there's a big politician is expected to act in politically wise ways, or if there's a famous, I don't know if this is a good metaphor, but actors in Bollywood and Hollywood are famous too. Maybe the point is, being famous, they're always under public scrutiny. What a politician does is subject to public scrutiny. What actors and actresses do is subject to public scrutiny. And when these famous people rise very high, there's a saying, the higher you rise, the further you can fall. So someone who's come up very high in life stands to lose a lot through this public shaming, we'll call it, public shaming. So if they do something wrong, if a very important person makes a mistake, if an insignificant person makes a mistake, who cares? If a beggar on the street makes a mistake, no one really cares. No one notices. But when a very famous person, a highly regarded person makes a mistake, everyone notices, and there is what's called public shaming of that person. The higher you go, the further you have to fall. Interesting argument for not rising so high in life. All right. Bhayat ranaruparatam, bhayat ranaruparatam, mansyante tvam maharata, mansyante tvam maharata, yesham chatvam bahumato, yesham chatvam bahumato, bhutva yasyasi laghavam, bhutva yasyasi laghavam. The commentator introduces this verse by making an argument. Suppose Arjuna feels that, okay, so a lot of people will criticize me. Arjuna is thinking, if I leave the battlefield, many people will criticize me. But those who know me, my own family members, they will know that I left the battlefield out of compassion and not out of fear. So consider, if Arjuna leaves the battlefield, what will it look like? To most warriors, it'll look like Arjuna left out of fear. And that's the point that Sri Krishna is making here. He says, and the point is, everyone, even warriors on his own side, not only his enemies will think he left out of fear, but even his own compatriots, the Kaurava warriors, will also think he left out of fear. Sri Krishna says here in the second line, Maharataha, the great warriors, can mean generals, the leaders, but Maharataha, the great warriors, mansyante, will consider Twam, you, Arjuna. All the great warriors out here on the battlefield, mansyante, will consider Twam, you, Arjuna, will consider that you, in the end of the first line, you, uparatam, you withdrew, ranat, from the battle, you withdrew from the battle, bhayat, due to bhaya, due to fear. Those warriors aren't going to think that Arjuna left because of compassion. Remember, that's what he felt in the first chapter when he looked across the battlefield for the first time and he saw all of his beloved family members on the battlefield on both sides that would die in the battle. Arjuna was filled with pity and compassion, not fear. Not fear. We discussed that at some length. But if he were to walk away from the battlefield, he's in the chariot right now with Sri Krishna, if he gets out of the chariot and walks away, everyone is going to think he left the battlefield. Why? Arjuna uparatam, withdrew, ranat, from the battle, bhayat, due to fear. Everyone will conclude. Yeshan cha, in the third line, cha, and yesham, amongst those, for those, twam bahumataha bhutva, twam, you Arjuna, bhutva, having become bahumataha, highly regarded, highly esteemed. For you Arjuna, you, having become highly esteemed, yesham, amongst all these warriors, having become highly esteemed amongst all these warriors, yasyasi, you will go laghavam. It's an idiom. Laghavam means lightness. Literally, you will go to lightness. And you can't take that literally. It's a metaphor. You will be considered insignificant. You'll be thought of as a lightweight, as someone who was cowardly and left the battle. In fact, cowardly is a nice way to translate that idiom. Yasyasi laghavam, you will be taken lightly, you will be considered cowardly. Okay, then. Further about the people watching Arjuna leave the battlefield, and what will they say? Avacha vadanscha bahun, avacha vadamcha bahun, vadishyanti tavahitaha, vadishyanti tavahitaha, nindantastava samartyam, nindantastava samartyam, tato duhkataram nukim, tato duhkataram nukim. Suppose the commentator imagines Arjuna's state of mind, and suppose Arjuna is thinking that even if my own Kaurava army considers me to be cowardly, suppose Arjuna has this thought, at least in fact, excuse me, I've been actually mistakenly using Kauravas when I meant Pandavas, Arjuna's compatriots are the Pandavas. And I think I misspoke once or twice before when I incorrectly used Kaurava to refer to Arjuna's side. Arjuna, of course, belongs to the Pandava army. So now, suppose the Pandavas consider Arjuna to be cowardly for leaving the battle, but maybe Arjuna might think, well, at least the Kauravas, his enemies will be relieved. Why will his enemies be relieved? If Arjuna doesn't fight, the enemies will be relieved because now they have a chance to win. With Arjuna fighting, they have virtually no chance of winning. But if Arjuna leaves the battlefield, the Kauravas will be delighted because now they have a chance to win. And here, Sri Krishna says, no way. He says in the second line, end, tava ahitaha. Tava, your. Ahitaha. Ahita is a word for enemy. Tava ahitaha, your enemies. Your enemies, your detractors, okay, but enemies is better. Your enemies, vadishyanti, will say what? Avacha vadan. Vadan, words, bahun, many words, which are avacha, words that shouldn't be spoken, words that you can't use in the Mahabharata, words that we can't use in normal dialogue, all those nasty, dirty, foul words that we can't speak. He says, even his enemies, the Kauravas, they may be relieved that Arjuna is not fighting, but they're not going to speak highly of Arjuna because they're still going to consider him a coward. Yes, they will be relieved that Arjuna is leaving the battlefield, but his enemies will still consider Arjuna to be a coward. And he says, Tava, in the third line, Tava samartya, nindantaha, not cursing, belittling, okay. Belittling, putting down is a common expression. Nindantaha, putting down, tava samartyam, tava, your, samartyam, your capabilities. Belittling your capabilities means seeing Arjuna, this mighty warrior, as a weak coward. So seeing Arjuna as a weak coward, even the enemies, even though they're relieved, they will curse Arjuna with all these nasty words. Remember, they're mighty warriors. Mighty warriors are not going to accept weakness from another warrior like Arjuna, so therefore they will curse him and belittle his greatness. Tataha dukataram nukem. Tataha dukataram. Worse than that. Nukim, what? What could be worse than that? To be cursed by your enemies in this way. Now, but we have a few minutes before we conclude, and there's an important point we need to make here. So here, Sri Krishna is making the argument about what other people will say. And there's a problem here. When our decisions are based on what others will think and say, we may or may not make the right decisions based on what others think and what others say. So let's get the context very clearly here. Sri Krishna's primary instruction to Arjuna is, do your duty. Swakarma, swadharma is the word used here. Swadharma, your own duties, Arjuna, you must fulfill. That's the primary argument. Then secondarily, Sri Krishna goes on to say, if you fulfill your duties, you'll be praised. And if you don't fulfill your duties, you will be cursed. That's really secondary, right? The primary argument here is do your duty. That's what you're supposed to do. And also you get to go to heaven, by the way. But remember, that's the latter consequence is going to heaven. But the initial consequence of doing the right thing, Swadharma, is praise. So if Arjuna fulfills his duties, he'll be praised. If he fails to fulfill his duties, he won't be praised. But now, here's the point I want to make. Suppose by following dharma, so Arjuna is going to follow dharma and he'll be praised for that. Suppose you find yourself in a situation that if you follow dharma, you'll be criticized. Does that happen? Sure it happens. There are plenty of times if you follow dharma, you'll be criticized. I give some common examples. In India nowadays, dowry is a big deal, and people are waking up to the fact that this dowry system is highly abusive. So suppose a family decides we're not going to accept dowry, we're not going to request it, we're not going to give it, whatever it is. By taking that position, you're following dharma, but that may make you subject to criticism by other old-fashioned Hindus and others. So that's an example. By following dharma, you may be criticized. You should do it anyway. Follow dharma regardless of the criticism of others. Maybe a better example, in fact, commonly now in India and this country, a family with a marriageable son or daughter, the son or daughter, they will agree to have the son or daughter marry someone who is outside of their caste or even outside of their religion, non-Hindu. The son or daughter says, I very much love this person, I want to marry this person, please give me your permission, even though this person is not in our caste or even though this person is not in our religion, please give me permission. And it's difficult for parents. I acknowledge that it can be very difficult for some parents to make this decision, but the right decision is to say yes and to allow your son or daughter to marry the person they love. But, and I would say without doubt, that is following dharma. But a good example, by following dharma, these parents then become subject to the criticism of so many others because their son or daughter is marrying someone that others consider unacceptable. Who cares if others consider the person unacceptable? What matters is what's acceptable to you. And what's ultimately acceptable is following dharma. And here, following dharma, even if you're criticized for it. And this is different than Arjuna's situation. If Arjuna follows dharma, he'll be praised for it. But there are situations in life that by following dharma, you are criticized and condemned for following dharma. If you sacrifice your principles because of what other people will think and say, that's sad. To give up your principles because of what other people will say. But how strong it is, how wonderful it is when you hold tight to your principles, when you do what is right, when you follow dharma, regardless of other people's opinions. Just a side comment. It's not Arjuna's situation, but it's relevant. Okay, we'll conclude here. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma kaschad dukkha bhag bhaveta asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.